To understand the cruelty of the Imperium of man, one must not look to the battlefields of the far future, but to the endless, suffocating halls of the Adeptus Administratum. High above the smog-choked canopy of a decaying hive world, millions of scribes labor in the pale glow of lumen globes. The air is thick with the scent of old parchment, sacred incense, and the stagnant sweat of generations. A ceaseless, maddening chorus dominates this world of stone and iron. It is the mechanical clicking of brass cogitators and the frantic, unending scratching of millions of autoquills. Here, in the cold heart of the imperial bureaucracy, human suffering is meticulously translated into data. Every world within the Emperor's domain is bound by the mathematics of damnation, classified by a merciless metric known as the Tithe grade. Planetary governors, lords who rule over billions with the power of gods, live their entire lives in the abject terror of this single assessment. To fail the quota is to invite the full, devastating wrath of the Adeptus terror. Therefore, emissaries of these planetary rulers stand trembling before the scribes, their silken finery stained with the cold sweat of dread. They watch as uncaring adepts pass through colossal stacks of heavy vellum. These documents record the lifeblood of a galaxy at war. They demand millions of tons of refined promethium, mountains of raw adamantium, and the flesh of billions of conscripts destined to die on nameless dirt. In this grand accounting, a human soul possesses no intrinsic worth. It is merely a numeric value pressed in black ink upon a ledger, a commodity to be weighed, spent, and discarded. Yet, hidden deep within the staggering demands for grain and lass weaponry, there exists a darker requirement. It is the special extraction quota, a demand paid not in raw materials, but in cursed flesh. This is the Psyker tithe. The Lex Imperialis is absolute and unforgiving in its mandate regarding the psychic mutation. It commands that every man, woman, and child who draws power from the warp must be surrendered to the black ships. There can be no exceptions, no mercy, and no hesitation. To hide a psychic mutant from the gaze of the Imperium is to court utter annihilation. A governor who conceals such a witch condemns their entire world to the apocalyptic fire of exterminatus. The Administratum does not care if the witch is a beloved child or a wretched beggar. They care only that the ledger balances. The pale, cybernetic eyes of a senior adept scan the final parchment, registering the terrified gasp of the governor's representative. The numbers have been tallied. The debt of souls is recognized. A heavy brass administratum seal is brought down with final, crushing force, sealing the extraction order in a pool of blood-red wax. With that single motion, the fate of thousands is finalized, and the quiet horror of the bureaucracy reaches down toward the violent, waiting darkness of the lower hive slums. The parchment of the administratum is forged in ink, but the tithe is paid in blood. Far beneath the gilded spires of the upper hive, the reality of the imperial quota manifests as a sudden, suffocating terror. Here, in the rotting bowels of the undersump, the air itself is a poison. Thick, acidic chemfog clings to the corroded bulkheads, weeping black condensation onto the grated walkways below. The smell of centuries of rot and stagnant sump water hangs heavy in the cramped corridors. Suddenly, the low, ambient hum of failing atmospheric scrubbers is swallowed by a far more terrifying sound. Heavy, ceramite-plated boots strike the iron lattice in perfect, merciless unison. A kill squad of local enforcers descends into the depths. They are the blunt instruments of a callous governor, clad in dark carapace armor and wielding authority that is absolute and utterly unchecked. As they march through the rusted canyons of the hab blocks, a desperate, breathless silence falls over the slums. Millions of unseen eyes peer through rusted vents and cracked bulkheads, praying to the god emperor that the jackboots will march past their own wretched doors. The enforcers halt before a single decaying hab unit. Within, an impoverished family sleeps in the meager warmth of huddled bodies, entirely ignorant of the doom standing upon their threshold. There is no warning. There is no declaration of rights. A localized breaching charge is clamped to the reinforced locking mechanism. A concussive crack erupts in the gloom, followed instantly by the agonizing shriek of buckling steel as the hab door is violently kicked inward. The enforcers flood the minuscule, pitch-black living space. High-intensity lumen beams mounted on their weapons slice through the darkness, blinding the terrified occupants. The crackle of powered shock mauls fills the small room, a harsh electrical snapping that promises agony. The family wakes not to a morning cycle, but to extreme, unhinged violence. Parents are dragged from their stained pallets by armoured hands, their pleas for mercy silenced by the brutal, bone-crunching strike of a reinforced gauntlet. Children scream in the blinding light, choking on the sudden influx of ozone and smoke. The enforcers tear the dwelling apart, smashing their meagre possessions, ripping up floor panels, and sweeping their lumens across the weeping faces of the subjugated. They treat these Imperial citizens not as human beings, but as vermin to be sorted and stamped out. The raid is a calculated application of overwhelming panic, designed to paralyze the mind and shatter any hope of resistance. The armored intruders are not here for contraband, nor are they here for the parents. Their violent gaze sweeps past the groveling adults, their weapon lights converging on the darkest corner of the cramped room. They isolate their true target, the hidden shame of this miserable bloodline. Cowering beneath a torn thermal blanket, trembling with a power that defies the natural order, is the child. The breach was only the beginning of the nightmare. For the crime of a miracle, a family was about to be unmade. The affliction had manifested innocuously, as the mutation so often does. Perhaps it was a rusted tin Grox toy, found hovering just an inch above the hab floor, without a string. Perhaps it was the way the child's eyes glowed with an unnatural, violet sheen in the dark, predicting the caustic chemstorms hours before the warning sirens ever wailed. To a mother and a father, these were moments of impossible wonder in a galaxy of grinding misery. To the Inquisition and the rigid laws of terror, they were the symptoms of a terminal, spiritual disease. The curse of the Psyker is a death sentence not merely for the flesh, but for the very soul of a bloodline. When the armoured enforcers closed in on the trembling anomaly, the primal bonds of blood overrode all rational fear. The parents did what any creature would do when its young is cornered. They threw themselves against the unyielding wall of black ceramite. The mother screamed with a raw, tearing desperation, her voice cracking as she offered her own life in exchange. She clawed at the rigid armor plates, pleading for mercy from men who had long ago excised such weakness from their hearts. The father fell to his knees, clutching at the heavy combat boots of the subjugators, weeping and begging them to take his flesh instead. Their devotion was met with the cold, mechanical brutality demanded by the Lex Imperialis. A heavy combat shotgun swung backward in a vicious measured arc. The iron-shod stock smashed into the mother's chest, the sickening crunch of collapsing ribs echoing off the cramped permacrete walls as she was thrown violently into the dark. The father fared no better. 3 shock mauls descended upon him in a merciless rhythm. Crackling energy ruptured his skin and shattered his bones until he was reduced to a twitching, bloody ruin on the floor. He could do nothing but watch through a veil of his own blood. Through the chaos of sanctioned violence, the child was violently yanked forward. A gauntleted hand twisted deeply into fragile hair, dragging the weeping innocent across the grated floor. Small, pale limbs flailed in absolute terror. The child shrieked for a mother who could no longer rise and a father who could no longer stand. These were the pure, uncomprehending tears of a child who only knew that her world was ending. Those tears reflected against the utterly faceless, polarized visors of the enforcers. Behind that dark plasteel glass, there was no pity, no regret, and no hesitation. There was only the grim, unfeeling duty of the black ship's harvest. They clamped heavy, cold iron shackles around wrists far too small to bear the weight. The child was dragged from the ruined sanctuary of the hab block, her wails echoing down the rusted metal corridors. As she was violently pulled over the threshold into the blinding lumen glare of the concourse, her terrified eyes darted frantically through the milling crowd. In her final moments as a recognized citizen of the Imperium, her desperate gaze locked onto the cold, unblinking stare of an administratum clerk waiting to tally the tithe. Chapter 4. The Ink and the Tears. The echoes of shattered families bleed into the cold hum of idling engines. The weeping child is hurled without ceremony into the back of a rusted transport cage. They tumble onto a grated floor, already slick with the tears and blood of others. A dozen small shapes huddle in the gloom of the iron belly. They are bruised, shivering, and entirely broken by the sudden brutality of their collection. Outside the slatted ironwork, the wailing of mothers and the desperate roars of fathers echo down the concrete canyons of the hab block. Yet the administratum adept standing on the loading ramp does not look up. The robed Lex Mechanic is completely deaf to the symphony of human misery playing out beneath the smog. Their augmetic eyes remain locked upon a flickering datapad, indifferent to the terrified souls mere inches away. A cybernetic finger traces a line of glowing green text. A numeric identifier is verified and crossed out. A heavy brass seal descends upon a length of parchment with dull finality. In that singular motion, the flesh and blood of a human child is transmuted into a mere statistical necessity. The grief of the parents is entirely invisible to the sprawling bureaucracy of the Imperium. There is no column on an administratum ledger for broken hearts, nor is there any calculus for sorrow. There is only the unyielding demand of the tithe. To comprehend the coldness of this moment is to understand the absolute terror that governs the human species. In the eyes of the master of mankind's vast empire, the psychic spark is never viewed as a miracle or a blessing. It is an inherent sin of the flesh and the spirit. It is a foul mutation, a microscopic crack in the armor of reality through which the malefic predators of the warp might feast upon an entire world. To be born a psyker is to be born condemned, carrying a death sentence written into the very fabric of your mind. Unless they are chained, broken, and strictly controlled by the merciless overseers of the Scholastica Psykana, these weeping children are nothing more than living gateways for demonic incursion. Their youth is an irrelevance. Their innocence is a dangerous illusion. Their suffering is the agonizing but acceptable price of species survival. The adept rolls the stamped parchment into a neat cylinder and slips it into a brass tube upon their belt. The planetary quota has been satisfied. The grand ledger of terror is balanced for another cycle. Without offering a single glance at the sobbing cargo, the adept raises a mechanical hand, signaling the lobotomized servitor crew to finalize the loading sequence. Rusted gears grind with a metallic screech as the heavy iron doors of the transport begin to swing inward. The sliver of polluted daylight rapidly shrinks, framing the unblinking, uncaring gaze of the Lex Mechanic for one final, agonizing second. Then the thick metal slams shut with the terrible weight of a tombstone. The children are instantly plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The rusted cage groans heavily as the suspensor arrays engage, pulling the shivering mass of condemned souls upward through the choking atmospheric layers. High above the choked atmosphere of the world, the void offers no sanctuary. The planetary transports rise on pillars of dirty flame, shedding the gravity of their birth world only to meet a far darker fate. Orbiting in geostationary silence are the vast Leviathans of the League of Black Ships. They are not vessels of glorious conquest. They bear no resemblance to the proud, cathedral-crowned dreadnoughts of the Imperial Navy, whose prows blaze with the golden light of the Emperor. Instead, these gargantuan craft are voids within the void. They are lightless monoliths that blot out the stars, blacker than the absolute zero of deep space. Each vessel is a mobile penitentiary spanning miles of reinforced adamantium, steeped in millennia of psychic agony and ancient dread. Though shrouded in arcane stealth fields and sensory bafflers, their lethal intent is undeniable. They bristle with macro cannon batteries and lance arrays capable of shattering continents, yet their true terror lies in their sheer lifelessness. No vox chatter bleeds from their comms arrays, no grand illumination betrays their position in the dark. They simply wait like apex predators of the abyss, heavily shielded and hungering for the tithe. From the planet below, a ragged swarm of orbital shuttles ascends toward the waiting fleet. The localized transports carry the chained youth gathered from the staging grounds on the surface. To the colossal black ships, these shuttles are nothing more than insignificant specks. They are drawn inexorably toward the massive, yawning hangar bays that open like the maws of deep-sea monsters. The giant ships swallow the tiny craft whole, taking in their miserable harvest by the thousands, just as a great beast of the deep consumes a cloud of helpless krill. Within the cockpits of the approaching transports, the shuttle pilots sweat in the freezing cold of their cabins. They are loyal servants of the local planetary governor, yet they avert their eyes from the abyssal hulls of the fleet. They are frantic, eager to disgorge their cursed cargo and flee back to the illusion of safety on the world below. They know that the void immediately surrounding the black ships is fundamentally wrong. It is a pocket of reality saturated with the suppressed terror of billions, an invisible pressure that makes the very metal of the shuttles groan. The pilots punch the docking codes with trembling, hurried fingers. They pray only that they will be allowed to leave unmolested. There is no return for those locked in the holds. As the shuttles cross the threshold of the shimmering void shields and glide into the cavernous landing bays, a profound finality settles over the sobbing children within. The moment the landing gear touches the cursed deck plates of a black ship, the captives have officially departed the realm of the living. They are no longer citizens of the Imperium, but raw fuel for the great machine. The immense exterior airlocks cycle shut with a reverberating toll, sealing out the distant starlight forever. In the suffocating gloom of the hangar, the shuttle engines whine and power down. The true horror of the voyage is about to be realized as the heavy hydraulic locks of the transport cargo doors finally disengage. Beyond the yawning maws of the loading bays, the interior of a black ship is a labyrinthine tomb of deliberate suffering. The colossal atmospheric recyclers bleed the air of all warmth, keeping the endless holds at a near-freezing temperature. This is no mechanical failure, but a calculated cruelty engineered to slow racing metabolisms and suppress the volatile spark of psychic mutation. Thick coats of white frost cling to the scarred iron bulkheads, glittering like crushed glass in the oppressive eternal gloom. Within these cavernous bellies of the silent fleet, multi-tiered cages stretch upward into an absolute, lightless obscurity. Inside these iron pens, tens of thousands of unformed psykers are packed together closer than livestock awaiting the slaughterer. They are heavily chained neck to wrist, shivering violently as their ragged breath plumes in the freezing dark. The stagnant air is a foul concoction that aggressively assaults the senses. It reeks of unwashed, starving bodies, the sharp chemical bite of electrified ozone, and the unmistakable coppery tang of absolute fear. These terrified masses are no longer sons, daughters, or loyal citizens of the Emperor. They have been systematically stripped of their names and their humanity, reduced entirely to raw, highly volatile material. They are nothing more than fuel for the Golden Throne, stored indefinitely within a sprawling void-faring freezer. Deprived of light, warmth, and all sensory comfort, they huddle together in a pathetic attempt to stave off the biting chill. Yet even the biting cold cannot entirely smother the unnatural fires of the warp that burn within their unprotected minds. Cramped so tightly against one another, their untamed psychic auras constantly bump, grind, and bleed together. This invisible friction creates a sickening ambient hum of collective trauma, a low, maddening vibration that resonates through the frozen deck plating. Countless panicked whispers overlap in the dark, a chaotic symphony of despair spoken in 1,000 broken dialects. Uncontrolled minor manifestations flicker uncontrollably through the freezing holds like dying fireflies. Patches of bulkhead frost transform momentarily into weeping blood, while stretched shadows contort into screaming faces. Rusted chains rattle violently without the movement of living flesh, animated by the ambient psychic bleed. It is an ocean of raw terror, a localized hell where every frightened mind feeds the mounting panic of its neighbor. The collective nightmare endlessly loops and magnifies, threatening to boil over into full demonic possession despite the freezing temperatures. Then, the agonizing hum of psychic static suddenly begins to falter. The desperate whispers choke and die in the raw throats of the shivering captives. A new sensation bleeds into the frozen holds, entirely unnatural and far more terrifying than the physical cold. It is a heavy, suffocating weight that aggressively presses down upon the soul, a profound emptiness that devours even the faintest warp light. The prisoners shrink back against the icy iron bars, their psychic sparks violently extinguished by a creeping silent dread. The wardens of the ship are finally descending into the dark. Chapter 7. The Anathema Psykana, Arrival of the Blanks. The freezing dark of the hold had been filled with the terrified weeping of the condemned. Then came a sudden and horrific silence. The ambient psychic whispering that had constantly plagued the raw minds of the captive youth died in an instant. It was not a peaceful quiet, but a sudden, violent amputation of the senses. The heavy bulkheads ground open to admit the dreaded Anathema Psykana. They are the Sisters of Silence, the left hand of the Emperor, and they moved into the rusted gloom with a terrifying, predatory grace. Clad in ornate, master-crafted power armor, their expressions were hidden entirely behind grim, unyielding visors that offered no trace of humanity. They spoke absolutely no words. The warriors communicated only in the rapid, complex gestures of an arcane sign language, their gauntlets dancing flawlessly in the shadows. To understand the true horror of their arrival, one must understand the dark miracle of the pariah gene. These stoic women are blanks, untouchables, soulless entities utterly immune to the treacherous currents of the warp. They cast no reflection within the Imperium. Where a normal human soul burns like a flickering candle in the dark, a blank is a ravenous black hole. They are an absolute void that devours the psychic ether itself. To a baseline human mortal, mere proximity to a Sister of Silence brings a creeping sense of severe discomfort, an instinctual revulsion, and a cold sweat that chills the blood. But to a fledgling Psyker, to a mind intrinsically linked to the boundless Empyrean, their presence is an absolute atrocity. It is akin to having their very soul crushed in a tightening iron vice. As the silent sisterhood fanned out across the deck, the freezing hold became an active torture chamber simply by virtue of their existence. The captive children were instantly struck by a crippling nausea so violent it robbed them of breath. Across the frost-bitten iron floor, the youths collapsed in writhing heaps of unimaginable spiritual agony. Sudden, heavy nosebleeds painted their pale, malnourished faces in crimson. Their eyes rolled back violently into their skulls as their fragile minds desperately tried to reject the profound, suffocating wrongness that had invaded their reality. The volatile psychic gifts that had condemned these children were being aggressively smothered by the anti-psychic aura of the blanks. Every deliberate step the armored women took radiated a sickening, invisible pressure. There was no physical blow struck, yet the air grew unbearably heavy, heavy enough to shatter sanity. The stoic warriors offered not a shred of sympathy, viewing the wretched agonies of the witches before them as a simple necessity. Their presence was a carefully calculated instrument of absolute suppression. Under the prolonged and crushing weight of this unnatural psychic nullification, the brittle minds of the terrified captives began to fracture and break apart. They lay completely helpless, convulsing and weeping blood upon the decking, fully ruined by the mere proximity of their unearthly jailers. It was in this state of total mental devastation that the massive engines of the Black Ship finally rumbled to life, preparing to drag them further into the endless nightmare of the void. Chapter 8. The Deafening Quiet. The chorus of weeping in the abyssal hold does not fade through comfort, nor does it die away from exhaustion. It is severed. As the silent wardens take their places among the iron cages, a profound and unnatural paralysis falls over the collected Tithe. To understand the torment of the witch is to understand the nature of their cursed minds. From the moment of their awakening, a Psyker is never truly alone. They are bound to the Imperium, accompanied always by the ceaseless, whispering tide of the warp. It is a background resonance, a song of impossible colors and unseen currents that beats in time with their own hearts. The Sisters of Silence do not merely silence that song, they tear the very capacity to hear it from the soul. The presence of a blank is a psychic black hole. It is a sensory void that collapses the architecture of the mind, leaving nothing but an agonizing, deafening quiet. The children in the dark are suddenly stripped of their sixth sense, plunged into an absolute isolation that the mundane human mind cannot comprehend. It is a suffocating dread, a localized aura of soul-crushing horror that freezes the breath in their lungs and pins them to the rusted decking. They are drowning in an emptiness so complete that it physically hurts. Their minds gasp for the familiar hum of the ether, but find only a sterile, bottomless abyss. In the far corner of the containment block, a shivering youth makes a desperate, instinctual mistake. Desperate for the thinnest fraction of comfort, the child reaches inward to summon a meager spark of psychic heat to ward off the freezing gloom. Instead of the familiar rush of the Imperium, the child's mind crashes into the absolute null zone of the pariahs. The mental projection is smothered by the void, forcing the child to peer into a mirror of absolute nothingness. There is no spark, no warmth, and no connection to the beyond. There is only the reflection of their own naked, screaming terror, amplifying infinitely within the blankness. The child collapses against the grating, eyes wide and jaw locked in a silent shriek, entirely broken by the revelation of true isolation. This is not a fleeting punishment. The silent wardens watch with cold, unblinking discipline as the agonizing reality settles over their cargo. This localized death of the soul is the baseline torture these captives will endure for every waking second of the months to come. They are locked inside their own skulls, trapped with nothing but their panic and the crushing weight of the untouchables standing guard over them. There is no escape from the deafening quiet. Deep beneath their feet, the colossal plasma drives of the black ship begin to cycle upward with a heavy, bone-rattling thrum. The material realm shudders around the containment holds as the ancient vessel prepares to tear the veil. The journey has only just begun, and the ship is ready to plunge its cargo of silent souls into the roaring nightmare of the warp. Chapter 9. The Groan of the Geller Fields. The translation into the Imperium is an act of violent heresy against the natural laws of the physical universe. The massive warp drives of the black ship scream as they tear a ragged wound in the fabric of reality. To those trapped within the lightless holds, the transition registers as a sickening sudden drop in the pit of the stomach. Gravity fails for a terrifying second, leaving the chained captives floating in the dark before slamming them violently back against the rusted iron grating. The lumen strips lining the vaulted ceilings flicker and die, bleeding their harsh glare into a bruised, sickly violet twilight that seems to stain the very air. Then comes the sound. It is a deep, agonizing groan of adamantium and ceramite, the terrible protest of a vessel plunging into an ocean of unreality. The ship is no longer sailing through the cold vacuum of space. It is submerging into the warp. Here, the Imperium churns as a dimension of pure, chaotic emotion, a roiling sea of madness that hungers eternally for the souls of the living. Between this malefic storm and the fragile meat of the human cargo lies only the Geller field. It is an invisible blister of forced reality, an esoteric shield that projects a thin skin of real space around the plunging ship. Without it, the vessel would be instantly dissolved, its crew and cargo consumed by the ravening entities that dwell in the deep currents of the Empyrean. The captives are locked in freezing cages, shivering in the gloom, but their true terror is not the cold. It is the profound, horrifying realization of exactly what swims just inches beyond the armored hull. Predators of impossible geometries and endless malice scrape their ethereal claws against the invisible barrier of the field. For an ordinary mortal, the passage is merely uncomfortable, marked by nausea and a vague sense of dread. For a Psyker, it is absolute agony. Their minds are intrinsically linked to the Imperium, their souls burning like blinding flares in the dark. Even suppressed by the suffocating aura of the Sisters of Silence, they can feel the crushing weight of the warp pressing inward. The sensation is akin to being trapped in a fragile submersible sinking far past its intended crush depth. The pressure is constant, grinding against their sanity with the weight of a billion screaming oceans. Every creak of the hull sounds like the laughter of demons. Every fluctuation in the ship's power grid threatens an ultimate soul-rending doom. They are trapped in a paradox of torment. Within the ship, the untouchables drain their life force to a hollow husk. Outside the ship, the boundless warp screams in a deafening chorus of hatred, desperate to devour their undefended minds. This unrelenting friction begins to fray the edges of the captive's endurance. The structural groan of the vessel becomes a physical ache in their temples, a relentless grinding that weakens the spirit. Slowly, inevitably, the immense psychic pressure of the Imperium begins to seep through the microscopic flaws in the Geller field. It pools in the dark corners of the holds like an unseen, toxic mist. The true ordeal of the voyage is only just taking shape, as the crushing weight of the outside begins to manifest within the cold metal walls. Chapter 10. Nightmares in the Dark. The translation from real space into the churning madness of the Empyrean is a violence endured not by the flesh, but by the soul. Beyond the humming ward generators of the Geller field, an ocean of pure, unfiltered malice beats against the hull. For the baseline human crew, this transit is merely a time of deep unease and quiet prayers to the God Emperor. But for the Psyker Tithe locked within the holding pens, it is an unending waking nightmare. These children are living conduits to the very realm the ship now navigates. Their nascent minds are beacons in the dark, and the denizens of the warp are inexorably drawn to their light. As the voyage stretches onward, the psychological pressure within the cramped bulkheads builds into a suffocating miasma of collective trauma. The boundaries between the real and the unreal begin to fracture. Because these captives are touched by the warp, their internal horrors do not remain trapped within their own skulls. Their dreams bleed outward, infecting the cold iron of their cage. Rime and frost creeping across the deck plating no longer form natural crystalline patterns. Instead, the ice freezes into the unmistakable shapes of agonizing, screaming faces. Under the weak, flickering glow of the failing lumen strips, the shadows detach themselves from the huddled masses. These silhouettes stretch and writhe independently, mocking the weeping children with pantomimes of torture. The air grows impossibly stale, thick with the copper stench of fear and the ozone tang of uncontrolled psychic bleed. Worse still is the auditory assault. There is a constant phantom scratching echoing through the deck. It sounds as though rusted claws are desperately trying to tear through the adamantium walls from the outside in. Exhaustion becomes a physical weight, pressing down upon the fragile frames of the captives. Yet sleep offers no sanctuary. To surrender to exhaustion is to open a door that must remain forever bolted. The moment a child closes their heavy eyelids, the demonic whispers begin. These are not formless terrors, but honeyed, insidious voices speaking directly to their deepest sorrows. The entities of the Imperium promise warmth, safety, and an end to the agonizing cold. They offer salvation from the black ships, asking only for permission to enter, to share the vessel of their flesh. Fighting off this seductive oblivion requires a strength of will that leaves the children trembling and broken. The attrition rate climbs steadily, driven not by starvation or disease, but by sheer, unadulterated terror. Young hearts, incapable of sustaining such a frantic pace, simply give out and stop beating. Others lose their minds entirely, collapsing into catatonic husks that stare blankly at the frost-covered walls. The holding pen becomes a claustrophobic pressure cooker of despair, where every gasp for breath feels like inhaling shattered glass. They are trapped in a lightless tomb, surrounded by the corpses of their peers and the maddening voices of the dark. The collective sanity of the remaining children is stretched so thin it becomes translucent. It is a fragile, agonizing equilibrium that cannot possibly hold. Somewhere in the shifting gloom, a single mind begins to fracture under the unbearable weight of the abyss. Chapter 11. The Breaking Point. The breaking point arrives not with a grand cosmic tear, but with a sudden localized collapse of sanity. Flesh and spirit can only endure so much before the fragile architecture of the human soul gives way. For one miserable child, the dual torment of the pariah aura and the ceaseless whispers of the warp finally proves too heavy to bear. The psychic dam shatters. It begins with a violent, unnatural convulsion that throws the emaciated body against the unyielding iron bulkheads. Spine arching in a grotesque mockery of supplication, the youth begins to thrash against the heavy suppression bindings. The metal links rattle with a frenzied, desperate rhythm that cuts through the suffocating gloom of the holding pen. Then comes the true horror of the manifestation. When the captive opens their eyes, the milky whites and pale irises are utterly gone. In their place is a pitch-black void that boils with an unholy, abyssal fire. A sickening chill spreads outward from the flailing figure, frosting the rusted decking and freezing the breath of the wretched souls shackled nearby. The child opens a cracked, bleeding mouth to scream, but the sound that emerges does not belong to the mortal realm. It is an impossible multitonal growl, a demonic chorus of a dozen overlapping entities speaking as one. The guttural resonance vibrates through the very hull of the vessel, promising agony and eternal ruin. Panic, raw and infectious, erupts instantaneously among the surviving captives. Surrounding children scramble backward in blind terror, their desperate movements choking them on their own iron collars. They scream as they claw furiously at the deck, tearing their fingernails and bruising their bare limbs in a futile attempt to escape the abominable corruption blooming in their midst. They know exactly what this signifies. The razor-thin margin of safety that keeps a black ship intact has just been catastrophically compromised. In the lightless depths of the void, every untested psyker is an unbarred doorway to the Imperium. When one unprotected mind loses control, the veil between realities is instantly shredded. A single possession can cascade into a full demonic incursion, threatening to devour the entire vessel and cast thousands of captive souls directly into the jaws of the dark gods. Raw warp energy crackles around the convulsing form of the shattered youth, scoring the steel walls with unnatural lightning. The stench of ozone and roasting flesh floods the suffocating air as the tethered chains begin to heat to a dull red glow. Absolute pandemonium reigns as the corrupted psyker begins to channel the unchecked wrath of the Imperium. The holding pen devolves into a localized hellscape of shrieking children and tearing metal. In this perilous crucible, there is no room for hesitation, no time for mercy or salvation. The breach must be closed before the warp entity can fully anchor its foul presence in real space. The manifestation of the archenemy demands an instantaneous and absolute response. There is no outcry of salvation, no desperate attempt to redeem the corrupted soul. From the shadows of the pitch-black hold steps, a null maiden of the silent sisterhood. Her very presence is a suffocating weight that presses upon the minds of the chained children, an invisible gravity that chokes the warp itself. She wears the golden armor of her ancient order, yet she brings only the cold promise of the grave. She does not speak, she does not hesitate. She raises her weapon with the practiced, fluid grace of a born executioner. The judgment of the master of mankind is delivered in a singular, deafening roar. A mass-reactive bolter shell detonates in the enclosed darkness of the cargo deck. The explosive crack is a brutal physical blow that violently shatters the absolute silence of the miserable captives. For a fraction of a second, the blinding strobe of the muzzle flash illuminates the cavernous hold. In that stark, merciless light, the terrified faces of 1,000 caged youths are carved in harsh relief. They stare in wide-eyed horror at the utter annihilation of their former companion. The immense projectile strikes center mass and detonates furiously, reducing the mutating child to a fine mist of blood and ruined bone before the warp can fully anchor its twisted roots. There is no body left to mourn, only a terrible, formless ruin. Instantly, the heavy, dragging footsteps of cybernetic hulks follow the silent executioner. Mindless servitors lumber into the cage block, their lobotomized flesh permanently grafted to heavy promethium flamers. They unleash roaring torrents of blinding liquid fire upon the shattered remains. The intense heat blasts through the iron bars, blistering the skin of the surviving children in the adjacent cages. This holy immolation is a grim but necessary ritual, designed to scorch away any residual demonic tether from the physical realm. The sensory horror of this summary execution permanently burns itself into the unprotected minds of the witnesses. The thunderous, overlapping echo of the bolter shot rings endlessly within the rusted iron walls, leaving ears bleeding and heads throbbing in agony. The blinding afterimage of the strobe flash dances upon their retinas, a phantom memory of sudden death. Worst of all is the cloying, inescapable stench of roasted meat and chemical accelerants. Thick, greasy black smoke quickly fills the unventilated hold. The surviving children are forced to inhale the drifting ashes of the condemned. Every desperate gasp chokes them with the physical remains of weakness. The lesson is brutally branded into their very souls with absolute clarity. If your mind breaks, your flesh will burn. There is no pity in the cold void, only the unforgiving mathematics of human survival. They sit trembling in the suffocating dark, weeping silently into the grim ash that coats their shivering bodies. They pray only for a swift deliverance from this floating hellish purgatory. Mercifully, the relentless shuddering of the great adamantium hull begins to change its chaotic rhythm. The nightmare tides of the Imperium are finally loosening their malevolent grip upon the black ship. The ancient engines begin to cycle downward, signaling the long-awaited approach to the real space translation point. The veil of the Imperium tears open with a silent scream, disgorging the blackened hull of the voidcraft into the cold sanctuary of real space. The nightmare of the warp is over, replaced by the blazing brilliance of the Sol system. Before them lies holy terror, the Throneworld of mankind, and the beating heart of a million systems. It is a sphere of unimaginable majesty, an ecumenopolis dominated by a single continent-spanning cathedral of gold and marble. Glittering orbital plates crown the world like a halo of stained glass and steel. Impenetrable defensive rings interlock in the void, bristling with macro cannons and lance batteries capable of shattering moons. Through the dark, the traffic of a million holy vessels moves in endless solemn processions. Over every Vox channel, choirs of billions sing eternal hymns of devotion, broadcasting the glory of the Emperor across the sterile vacuum of space. It is the most exalted, sacred place in the galaxy, a testament to the unyielding grandeur of the human empire. Yet hidden within the belly of the newly arrived black ship, the true cost of this golden empire is laid bare. In the dark, stinking holds, the survivors of the warp crossing huddle in their own filth. They are starved, traumatized wretches, their bodies covered in sores and the grey ash of those who failed the journey. As the harsh, unforgiving light of terror filters through the crackling pict screens, the captives blink with hollow, terrified eyes. They look upon the glittering capital not with awe, but with the raw, shivering dread of the hunted. Here lies the supreme tragic irony of the Imperium of man. The blinding radiance of the Throneworld, the endless choirs, and the towering spires of the Imperial Palace are not sustained by faith alone. This staggering beauty is powered by the blood, the minds, and the very souls of the abused children chained in the cargo bays. They are the fuel for the golden engine, the secret sacrifice upon which the entire galaxy balances. Without their silent agony, the Golden Throne would fail, and the empire of humanity would drown in the dark. The black ship does not linger in the high orbit of the pilgrim fleets. It moves with grim purpose through the defensive cordons, granted immediate and unquestioned clearance by the towering Aegis platforms. Deep within the vessel, the holding pens begin to cycle, flooding with freezing lumen light and the mechanical grind of opening bulkheads. The time of the harvest has finally come. Heavy assault landers and armored shuttles detach from the underbelly of the great ship, plunging down through the toxic, storm-racked atmosphere of the Holy World. They fall like iron tears toward the sprawling, shadowed abysses that lie forgotten beneath the golden spires. Their trajectory leads them away from the light, diving relentlessly toward the colossal adamantium gates of the processing vaults, hidden deep beneath the roots of the Imperial Palace. The transport ramps lower with a thunderous groan, spilling their cargo into the blinding radiance of the ultimate sanctuary. The captives are driven forth from the bellies of the iron Leviathans. They form a pathetic, trembling procession of starved and traumatized souls. Flesh hangs loose upon jutting bones. Their eyes are wide with the uncomprehending terror of the newly damned. They step out not into a barren wasteland, but into the absolute crushing opulence of the Imperial Palace. Here, the floors are polished marble inlaid with veins of pure Terran gold. It is a sacred surface that has never known the touch of the unworthy. Now the bare, bloody feet of broken children leave smears of crimson across the flawless stone. Every staggering step is an agony, a desecration of the holy ground that only amplifies their profound insignificance. The sheer scale of the architecture is a weapon designed to obliterate the mortal mind. Towering above the procession are statues of the Emperor's Angels of Death, soaring hundreds of feet into the artificial heavens. Their colossal stone visages are fixed in expressions of pitiless devotion, judging the frail mortals marching far below. From unseen heights, the echoing voices of 1,000-strong cherubim choir cascade down the cavernous walls. They sing unending hymns of eternal sacrifice and righteous suffering. The air is impossibly thick with the cloying, sacred smoke of burning incense. It is a holy fog that burns the starving lungs and masks the scent of fear radiating from the herd. This is a vision of divine exaltation, a paradise crafted by human hands to glorify the master of mankind. Yet this blinding glory is merely a veneer. The palace guards, clad in armor of burnished bronze, do not look upon the captives with pity. They brandish heavy shock mauls, herding the weeping multitudes like mindless cattle. The procession is not permitted to linger in the light of the upper halls. Instead, they are marched away from the golden splendor and forced onto massive, spiraling ramps that plunge relentlessly downward. They are descending into the true domain of the Imperial Dungeon, into the abyssal vaults beneath the Sanctum Imperialis. With every agonizing step into the depths, the holy light begins to wane. The angelic singing of the choirs grows distant, slowly replaced by the deep, rhythmic thrumming of ancient machineries. The sweet incense gives way to the suffocating stench of oiled brass, stagnant water, and ancient sweat. This is a descent into a mechanical underworld, hidden far beneath the gilded surface of terror. The golden marble is replaced by cold iron and rust. The angelic statues give way to looming, shadow-draped pillars of jagged ferrocrete. The children stumble through labyrinthine sublevels, swallowed by a claustrophobic darkness that has not seen the sun in 10,000 years. They are being driven deep into the forgotten, abyssal layers of the Throneworld. Somewhere down in the absolute dark, the holding pens await. The rusted labyrinth tightens around them, funneling the broken procession toward the final threshold where all humanity will be stripped away. Chapter 15. The Erasing of Names. Deep within the lightless bellies of the subterranean processing vaults, the final vestiges of humanity are violently torn away. The captives are driven into vast, echoing chambers of rust and unforgiving iron. Their filthy rags, the last pathetic shields against the cold, are ruthlessly stripped from their trembling bodies by the indifferent claws of processing machines. They are left utterly naked, shivering in the damp chill of the earth deep below the Imperial Palace. Without warning, high-pressure deluge nozzles erupt from the vaulted ceilings overhead. A violent torrent of freezing, chemical-laced, sanctified water slams into the huddled masses. The harsh baptism scours the grime of transit from their fragile skin, burning their eyes and leaving them gasping for breath. This brutal ablution is not meant to cleanse the soul, but to prepare the organic matter for its holy purpose. With the mortal filth washed away, the true spiritual obliteration begins. Administratum ledgers, those fragile parchment records bearing the birth names of the tithed, are unceremoniously sealed away in abyssal macro vaults to rot in the dark. A given name is a luxury the Imperium cannot afford to grant its sacrifices. Whether they were born as beloved sons, cherished daughters, or forgotten orphans matters no longer. Their pasts are reduced to falling ash. In the place of human identity, The cold logic of the Adeptus Mechanicus imposes its own iron will. Lumbering lobotomized servitors step forward from the shadows, their myriad cybernetic appendages twitching with pre-programmed precision. These half-machine horrors possess no capacity for pity, no lingering echoes of a soul to hear the desperate pleading of the innocent. In their heavy grips, the servitors wield searing hot branding irons and vibrating bio-tattoo needles. The stagnant air quickly fills with the suffocating stench of scorched meat and burnt hair. A sickening sizzle rings out as the red-hot iron is pressed directly into the tender necks and pale foreheads of the crying children. Piercing screams echo endlessly off the vaulted walls, a choir of absolute agony that falls upon deaf, mechanical ears. The bio-needles punch rapidly into their blistering flesh, injecting permanent black ink to form complex barcodes and long numeric serial designations. Every shriek of pain is met only with the rhythmic whirring of gears and the dull hiss of pneumatic joints. The servitors move from one screaming child to the next with terrifying, methodical indifference, executing their brutal routines without a single hesitation. Through this agonizing alchemy of pain, the final dehumanization is completely achieved. The weeping figures huddled on the blood-slicked grates are no longer citizens of the Imperium. They are no longer human beings capable of love, hope, or fear. They have been officially catalogued as refined fuel, nothing more than living batteries marked for immediate consumption. Stripped of their names and marked with the cruel geometry of the machine, their trembling bodies are herded onward through the great adamantine blast doors. They stumble forward into the blinding industrial glare of the inner sanctums, where the waiting tech priests stand ready with scalpels and cranial jacks to physically prepare them for the insatiable hunger of the Golden Throne. Chapter 16. The Sarcophagi of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Flesh is but a flawed vessel in the eyes of the Adeptus Mechanicus. To prepare the psychic tithe for the master of mankind, the weakness of the biological form must be subjugated by the merciless certainty of steel. Blind tech priests of the Martian priesthood swarm over the newly numbered flock. They are nightmare amalgamations of rust-red robes and clicking metal, their own humanity having been surgically excised centuries ago. They murmur droning binharic hymns that echo endlessly off the rusted iron bulkheads. To these cyborg overseers, human flesh is merely a defective component in need of brutal recalibration. Heavy, whirring mechadendrites lash out from beneath their crimson vestments to seize the thrashing captives. There is no anesthetic offered in these surgical bays. Pain is considered nothing more than an irrelevant biological data stream, a temporary malfunction of the nervous system. Surgical buzzsaws and abrasive grinding arrays descend without hesitation, violently shearing the hair and skin from fragile scalps. Blood flows freely down the faces of the terrified captives as the priests begin their sacred, horrifying work. Pneumatic drivers slam heavy metallic cranial plugs directly into yielding bone. Thick neural shunts are driven deep into the base of the skull and hammered down the length of the spine. These brutal implants sever the natural nerve endings of the ungrateful flesh, replacing them with holy conduits of conductive silver and blessed copper. The frantic shrieks of the young psykers are entirely ignored by their unfeeling mechanical tormentors. With their skulls violated and their nervous systems forcibly rewritten, the bleeding captives are dragged toward the sensory deprivation caskets. These ancient sarcophagi stand upright like rusted iron maidens of a forgotten barbaric age. Their cramped interiors are thickly lined with esoteric wiring, blackened psychic conduits, and stained restraints of heavy leather. They are instruments of absolute containment, specifically designed to stifle the screaming mind and harvest its ethereal power. The weeping children are violently shoved into these suffocating shells. Grasping mechanical claws secure their trembling limbs in rigid, unbreakable holds. The newly installed cranial plugs are viciously jacked into the casket internal systems with a sickening metallic crunch. In an instant, the captives are flooded with binharic static and the cold, unfeeling data ghosts of the ancient machinery. The claustrophobia is absolute and entirely crushing. They are pinned beneath a labyrinth of invasive cables. unable to move a single millimeter, unable to even turn their heads. Then the heavy adamantium lids are violently slammed shut. The reverberating boom of massive locking mechanisms seals the Tithe in total, impenetrable pitch blackness. Inside the dark, the terrified sacrifices are wired directly into the ancient, uncaring machinery of terror. Their raw psychic potential is tethered to a planetary grid that spans the entire Throneworld, draining their vitality drop by drop. They are utterly alone in the suffocating void, trapped in a metallic womb of eternal agony. Beneath them, immense iron gears grind to life with a deafening groan. The sealed sarcophagi are violently shunted onto a colossal automated conveyor system. Row after row of featureless iron coffins begin their slow mechanical procession into the deepest belly of the Imperial Palace. They move relentlessly forward upon the rattling transport belts, carried ever closer toward the blazing, inescapable heart of the final chamber. The black iron of the great conveyor does not pause for grief or mercy. It is a continent of moving metal, a grinding mechanical river flowing endlessly into the subterranean heart of the Imperial Palace. Thousands upon thousands of sealed adamantium caskets ride this relentless tide, stretching out into the suffocating smog as far as the eye can see. Within each claustrophobic shell lies a frightened child, entombed in absolute darkness. The atmosphere outside their metal prisons is unimaginably hot, thick with the exhaust of a million grinding cogs. It reeks of superheated grease, raw ozone, and the bitter, choking tang of burning copper. This is the final, inescapable pilgrimage of the psychic Tithe. Booming from colossal vox arrays mounted along the cavernous ceiling, the triumphant hymns of the Adeptus Ministorum echo through the poisoned air. Monolithic choirs of cyber cherubs and augmented priests sing deafening praises to the eternal sacrifice of the Master of Mankind. They chant of glorious salvation and holy duty, their synthetic voices soaring in rapturous ecstasy. Yet beneath this exalted religious veil beats the sickening, undeniable rhythm of unfeeling industry. This is no mystical ritual born of willing martyrdom. It is a grim, mechanized assembly line feeding souls to a starving god. The rhythmic, deafening thud of colossal pneumatic pistons drives the belts ever forward. Gears the size of cathedral spires crush and churn, carrying the harvest of humanity closer to the end of all things. Inside their narrow coffins, the captives are utterly helpless. Their frantic weeping and bloody fists striking against steel are entirely swallowed by the roaring machinery and the booming anthems of the ecclesiarchy. They cannot move their shackled limbs. They cannot breathe without inhaling the recycled stench of their own mounting terror. They can only listen to the holy choirs proclaiming their impending annihilation as a magnificent triumph. The sheer, staggering scale of the operation defies all mortal comprehension. Millions of tons of interlocking steel work in perfect, factory-like efficiency to facilitate this industrialized slaughter. There is no dignity in this endless procession, only the cold and unforgiving mathematics of human survival. The Imperium does not burn these innocent souls out of mere malice. It processes them as raw, combustible fuel, shoveling them into the psychic furnace of the Golden Throne with the same mundane indifference as a factorum burning cheap promethium. The staggering heat intensifies tenfold as the conveyor grinds deeper into the thrumming, radioactive core of the palace. Looming ahead in the golden, toxic haze, the terminus of the belt finally comes into terrible focus. Vast mechanical manipulator arms twitch and spasm with automated, soulless precision, waiting patiently to receive their grim cargo. The holy chanting from the speakers reaches a fevered, deafening crescendo that shakes the very foundations of the earth. The sealed caskets are shunted forward, trembling violently against the unstoppable momentum of the iron river. They are pushed into the shadow of the primary conduits, where the weeping fuel of the Emperor awaits the violent embrace of the eternal machine. The sarcophagus slams into its designated terminal with the uncompromising finality of a closing vault. Massive power conduits, thick as the blackened trunks of ancient Terran oaks, lock into the casket's cranial ports with heavy iron cruelty. The great mechanisms of the feeding array engage. This is not the clean, sudden oblivion of a physical execution. It is the violent spiritual ignition of a mortal soul. At the throw of an unseen lever, esoteric machinery drives copper and brass shunts deep into the grey matter of the sacrificed. Yet the physical torment of these invasive spikes pales into absolute nothingness. It is completely eclipsed by the unfathomable, existential agony of a spirit being forcibly drawn from its flesh. The arcane mechanisms seize the child's invisible essence with merciless psychic tethers. The soul is pulled taut, stretched across the metaphysical anvil of the Emperor's grand apparatus. Then, the tethered spirit is set on fire. The Golden Throne demands raw, roiling psychic fuel, and only the total immolation of raw psychic potential can generate such power. The soul does not simply vanish. It is burned alive, consumed layer by layer in a supernatural inferno. The airtight casket vibrates violently against its massive moorings. The occupant thrashes in relentless convulsions that shatter their own fragile bones. No scream can escape the heavy adamantium seals of the coffin. In the cold physical realm, the sacrifice is entirely silent. But within the violent, churning tides of the Imperium, this ignition registers as a screaming cataclysm. The burning soul blazes like a dying, catastrophic star in the suffocating darkness of the warp. It forms an incandescent beacon of pure suffering, burning with such intense psychic agony that even the predatory entities of the abyss are forced to recoil from its blinding glare. The pain transcends biological limitations and corrupts the very concept of time. For the emotionless tech priests observing the ritual, the draining process is measured in mere minutes of optimal mechanical operation. For the psyker trapped within the sarcophagus, the agony stretches outward into an endless, subjective eternity. The mind perceives a ceaseless and unending inferno. Every cherished memory, every desperate terror, and every lingering hope is meticulously stripped away and consumed to sustain the master of mankind. The flesh rapidly withers to dust and ash, but the immortal spirit is artificially bound to the crucible. It is forced to remain conscious, forced to endure the absolute zenith of pain until there is absolutely nothing left to burn. The sheer scale of this atrocity defies mortal comprehension when viewed as a collective harvest. To truly understand the horrific cost of the Imperium's daily survival, one cannot merely look upon the towering machinery of the palace. One must step away from the grand, sprawling tragedy of the teeming masses. One must look past the swirling incense and the chanting choirs to peer directly into the suffocating darkness of a single iron coffin. One must look through the eyes of the terrified occupant as the eternal fire takes hold. Chapter 19. The Existential Nightmare. Deep within the blinding inferno of the psychic crucible, one mind is isolated in the rising tide of annihilation. It is the mind of a child from a world of grey rain and rusting spires. Through the blinding agony of the ignition, a terrifying clarity descends upon their frail consciousness. The psychic fire strips away the illusions of their short, terrified existence. They remember the night the enforcers battered down the hab door. They remember the inconsolable weeping of their mother as the black-armoured wardens dragged them away by the hair. They remember the suffocating dark of the black ship, the whispered prayers in the holding pens, and the desperate hope that they were being taken to serve a benevolent god. Now, as the golden fire consumes their astral form, the ultimate and horrific truth is laid bare before them. Every moment of their life was meticulously cultivated for this singular, agonizing purpose. Their birth was not a blessing but the yielding of a crop. Their childhood was merely the necessary ripening of a psychic battery. The tears of their parents, the terror of the cull, the grueling nightmare of the voyage, all of it was merely logistics. They were brought across the galaxy for no other reason than to scream in the dark for a handful of hours. There is no glorious martyrdom in this casket. There is no divine communion with the master of mankind. The Emperor does not know their name. The Emperor does not see their sacrifice. He is a distant, ravenous son, and they are nothing but a single drop of promethium thrown into his endless furnace. The profound betrayal shatters what little remains of their sanity. All their childish hopes, their quiet dreams of returning home, their desperate pleas for mercy, they were utterly meaningless. The Imperium of man does not love them. It despises them, fears them, and harvests them with the cold indifference of a machine processing ore. They are not a savior. They are kindling. The existential weight of this realization is heavier than the crushing psychic pressure of the choir. It is a bleak, suffocating despair that burns hotter than the sanctified flames devouring their nervous system. They try to weep, but their physical eyes have already boiled away in their sockets. They try to scream, but their vocal cords are nothing more than scorched ribbons of dead flesh. There is only the silent, deafening howl of a soul, realizing it was born entirely for the slaughter. The realization peaks, a pinnacle of pure despair, and then the final thread of their consciousness snaps. The child dissolves into the golden inferno, their identity erased from the universe forever. The psychic scream fades into the background harmony of 1,000 dying voices. Within the sealed sarcophagus, the blackened bones crumble into fine, lifeless ash. The flickering light of the casket dies out, leaving a hollow void waiting to be swept clean. Chapter 20. Ash and the Rotting God. The agony reaches its absolute zenith, and then there is nothing. The psychic flame that once defined a radiant human life is snuffed out forever. Consumed by the endless, ravenous hunger of the Golden Throne, the child simply ceases to be. No afterlife awaits them. No benevolent deity gathers their essence into a peaceful, celestial embrace. There is only the cold void of total obliteration, a complete unmaking of the soul. Inside the pitch-black confines of the iron casket, the physical form is instantly deprived of the vital life force that held its mortal matter together. Flesh, blood, and brittle bone wither in the span of a single silent heartbeat. The frail body collapses inward upon itself, rapidly disintegrating into a pathetic mound of fine grey ash. There is no mourning for this ultimate, devastating sacrifice. There is only the cold, mechanical indifference of ancient machinery performing its solitary, mindless function. Heavy locking mechanisms disengage with a resounding metallic finality. A sudden pneumatic hiss purges the interior of the sacrificial coffin. The lifeless dust of the child is unceremoniously flushed down a vast, yawning disposal chute. There, it cascades into the lightless subterranean depths of the Imperial Palace, mingling with the compacted ash of billions who came before. They are nameless, forgotten, reduced to literal sediment beneath the gilded foundations of holy terror. Then comes the inevitable heavy clunk of the great conveyor belt, violently shifting forward. The next casket slots seamlessly into the grim apparatus. Fresh conduits violently attached to unresisting flesh, ancient runes flare to blinding life, and the screaming begins anew. This unending cycle of torment is the horrific truth that underpins our entire galactic existence. Cast your mind upward, past the endless tiers of mechanized misery, to the colossal dais of the Golden Throne. Look upon the master of mankind. He is no longer a savior of flesh and blood, but a rotting corpse trapped in eternal, silent agony upon an ancient chair of gold. He is a decaying god, sustained not by divine grace, but by an endless, parasitic slaughter of his own subjects. The continued survival of the Imperium is not a heroic triumph of the human spirit against the dying of the light. It is a daily atrocity of unimaginable systemic cruelty. We have willingly traded our collective humanity for a few more miserable rotations of a dying, blood-soaked galaxy. 10,000 years of brutal stagnation have been bought and paid for with the souls of the innocent. 1,000 psykers are fed to the blinding furnace every single day, forever. There is no grand salvation waiting at the end of this dark millennium. There is only the grinding, rusty machinery of an empire that has long forgotten how to live, choosing instead to endlessly defer its own inevitable death. The great monolithic engines of terror will continue to churn through the flesh of the psychic tithe. The unseen choirs of the damned will continue to sing their final, shrieking hymns to a deaf universe, and above it all, the endless ticking of the great bureaucratic clocks marches on, coldly measuring out the lives of the sacrificed 1 second at a time. We are a hollow empire of ash, ruled by a dead god, waiting in the dark for the end of all things.